Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here, and this is one in our series of summer lectures. Most of our summer lectures are dealing with the topic of the 40th anniversary of the East Building. This lecture is not connected to the theme of the East Building anniversary. It's connected to another anniversary that's being celebrated across the world, and that is this year of 2018 is the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman. Bergman was born in Uppsala, Sweden, on July 14th. Here are two photographs of Bergman. One on the left is from the 60s, the one on the right is a later one from 2001. Ingmar Bergman is, of course, an incredible talent. He looms over the 20th century in terms of a filmmaker. He was a director, a writer, a producer. He worked in many media. He worked in film, he worked in television, he worked in theater, opera, radio. He's one of the most influential filmmakers ever. He directed over 60 films and documentaries for cinema and for television, and almost all of those he also wrote. He directed some 170 plays and numerous opera productions as well. He forged really powerful creative partnerships with two cinematographers. And when we talk about Bergman, when we talk about any director, you have to talk about the cinematographers, the directors of photography that they work with. And most often directors, once they find somebody they like, they work with them frequently. But in the case of Bergman, it was more than just an occasional collaboration. The two cinematographers are instrumental in understanding Bergman's visual language. One is Gunnar Fischer, and the other one is Sven Nykvist. Then, in the same manner that he came back repeatedly to the same cinematographers, he came back to the same actors. He created a little troupe of actors. Many of these are very familiar to you: Bibi Andersson, Liv Ullmann, Erland Josephson, Max von Sydow. All of these were repeatedly in his films. So he had a high comfort level when he would go on to the set and work. Almost all of his films were set in Sweden, so he didn't have to go off and scout locations throughout the world. And starting with the film Through a Glass Darkly, 1961, not only were they in Sweden, but they were on the island where he lived of Fura. So it was a very local kind of production. Of course, you know, he deals with all of these existential themes: love, death, illness, faith, betrayal, God, devil, the human condition, and this is what he's certainly most noted for, and certainly with reason. Here are his two close collaborators as cinematographers. On the left is Gunnar Fischer. This is a photograph in the 50s. He worked initially early in his career with Fischer. They had something of a falling out, and Fischer moved on, but then he picked up with the cinematographer we always think of with Bergman. And that's in the right photograph. That's Sven Nykvist. Fischer died in 2011, and Nykvist died in 2006. Now, cinematography is photography, and how the film looks and is photographed. Since this is a talk about Bergman and the visual arts, the work of these gentlemen has to always be in your mind when I might be using the name Bergman, but of course these two gentlemen were very much involved in how the film looked visually. Now, there's the usual belief about Bergman, when you read the literature on him, is that, in fact, he wasn't that interested in art or in art history. But at the same time, you read things that are incorrect. You do read in some of his biographies that he studied art history, that he majored in art history in college. That's not true. And what we always associate his interests with, outside of film, of course, are theater and music. These two areas he repeatedly comes back to and speaks about the inspiration he derives from theater and music. And with again, good reason. He talks about film almost always as a rhythm. When you make a film, it's rhythmic. It has a certain rhythm to it. So this would be true of a stage play as well. But he was indeed aware of art history, painting. There's no way he could have avoided it. He was a man of wide cultural interests. And he mentions that when he was a child, and much of Bergman's art and career relates to his life, going back to his childhood, that as a child, his parents had a gigantic reproduction of this painting in their house. This is Arnold Böcklin's Island of the Dead from 1880. There are several versions of this. This is the one in the Kunstmuseum in Basel. And that this hung in his parents' home, a reproduction of this painting, and that was something that he just always sort of had in his mind from a visual point of view. So he certainly was sensitive to visual stimulation. More importantly, I think there are connections between Bergman and a couple of other famous Scandinavians. First and foremost would be the Swedish playwright August Strindberg, who's depicted here on the right in this portrait by the other individual that I think was influential on Bergman, and that's Edvard Munch. So these are two paintings by Edvard Munch, his own self-portrait with cigarette on the left from 1895, and then his portrait of August Strindberg on the right from 1892. Strindberg has a huge impact on Edvard Munch, and he also has a huge impact on Ingmar Bergman. And in my estimation, Edvard Munch, as a painter, has no true successor. Nobody picks up the mantle of Edvard Munch. It was just too personal. Edvard Munch's true successor is Ingmar Bergman. So you have to switch fields from painting to film to find a true successor, I think, to Munch. Their works explore almost exactly the same kinds of themes and subject matter. They have almost exactly the same kind of childhood, the same kind of childhood traumas. They come from, to put it nicely, a pretty buttoned up Scandinavian tradition of raising children and other things. So I'm going to be referring to Munch extensively through this talk. And both of these individuals looked to Strindberg for inspiration, but especially, again, Bergman. As a theater director, he directed 11 Strindberg plays for the stage. He did 8 for the radio and 2 for television. So a big output of his work as a director of theater was doing Bergman. I was doing Strindberg. He was 12 years old when he decided he would purchase the complete works of Strindberg, which is 55 volumes. So that was a lot of summer reading. He sort of considered Strindberg almost a god, like a household god. He didn't always share Strindberg's views. They differed on some things, but he had a tremendous affinity for Strindberg, kept a portrait of Strindberg in his house on the island of Fura. And he said about Strindberg, he said many things, but at one point he said that Strindberg, quote, expressed things which I had experienced and which I could not find words for. When he talked about, Bergman came to be known as the greatest theater director of Strindberg's plays. He succeeded a man who was very much beloved and equally famous as a director of Strindberg. His name was Olaf Melander. But Bergman remarked about going to productions of Strindberg that had been directed by Melander when he was young. And the one that stuck in his mind is indeed the play that's the most important. It's called The Dream Play. And Bergman said, quote, about going to see these plays, he said, quote, first it was the dream play. Night after night I stood in the wings and sobbed and never really knew why. After that came To Damascus, the saga of the Folkungs, and the Ghost Sonata. It is the sort of thing you never forget and never leave behind, especially not if you happen to become a director, and least of all if you direct a Strindbergian drama. It's interesting because, of course, Strindberg was also a painter. So here are 2 paintings by Gus Strindberg. Storm in the Archipelago, subtitled The Flying Dutchman on the right from 1892, and Birch Tree on the left from 1902. I'd like you to keep that tree in your mind. We're going to come back to it in a different context much later. Strindberg painted throughout his life, especially in 3 specific periods, starting around 1872 and then a few years after the turn of the century. There was a big exhibition of Strindberg's paintings at the Musée d'Orsay back in 2001. So everything
or let's put it this way, much about Strindberg that everybody takes, what they take from Strindberg, very often revolves around the dream play. Here's a photograph of Strindberg from 1908, and a quote from Strindberg talking about the dream play. He writes the dream play in 1902 after experiencing a serious and complete nervous breakdown in Paris, and that led him sort of to the brink of madness, which is interesting because right at that same time Munch is having a breakdown, just sympathetically. Strindberg calls this period in his life the Inferno, referring to Dante. And his aim out of that experience was to write a play that essentially imitated the form of a dream. And he described the play as you see here. I'm giving you the quote, but I'll just read it quickly. This is only part of a longer quote. Everything can happen, nothing is impossible. When I say everything can happen, everything is possible and plausible. Time and space do not exist. On an insignificant foundation of reality, the imagination spills out and weaves new patterns, a blend of memories, experiences, unfettered fantasies, absurdities, and improvisations. The characters split, double, multiply, and evaporate. They condense, distill and again reunite. But one mind rises above them all, it is the dreamer. For him, there are no secrets, no consistencies, no scruples, no law. In essence, what he's describing here is a format of a play that is non-realistic, but more specifically to the time in the theater and art world, what we would call expressionistic. So Strindberg is developing in this play especially the idea of expressionism in theater. So expressionism tends to stress especially these dichotomies between reality and imagination, life and death, the idea of what's real, what's not real, what goes on in the mind. And Bergman was particularly attracted to this way of thinking. And almost everywhere in Bergman, one thing you get repeatedly is the importance of the dream versus reality. So you'll see it in Wild Strawberries, Hour of the Wolf, Fanny and Alexander, certainly in Persona. He's constantly sort of echoing Strindbergian ideas in that regard, and especially, again, the dream consciousness and the ambiguity of identity, how identity can shift. I'm going to just show you a quick survey here, nothing really that I want to say, I just want you to look. Some of the work of Bergman and the two great cinematographers. So here's a shot from Summer Interlude on the left from 1951. Well, these are both from Summer Interlude, 1951. This is the work of Gunnar Fischer as a cinematographer. And the thing I'm trying to show you here is how pictorial, how painterly these really are. This is Smiles of a Summer Night, 1955. Fischer is again the cinematographer. Seventh Seal from 1957. Virgin Spring, 1960. And now I'm going to add something to the visual equation. I'm going to add Munch. So here is Bergman's Summer Interlude on the left from 1951, and I'm comparing it to Starry Night by Edvard Munch, the painting that's today in the Getty from 1893. I have no doubt that Bergman was. He doesn't tell us a lot about specific artists that he's looking at. Occasionally he does. One happens to be a work that's here at the National Gallery that I'll talk about a little bit later. But he's certainly aware of the Scandinavian tradition of visual art, and by that I do mean Scandinavian, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, even Finnish for that matter. So I think Munch is important. Here's Hour of the Wolf on the left. This is Sven Nykvist as the cinematographer from 1968, and then this is Munch's Summer Night by the Beach from 1902. Bergman's Summer Interlude on the left, 1951. Munch's Dance on the Shore from 1900 to 1902. Here I did something. I'm comparing on the left one of the frames from Summer with Monica by Bergman from 1953. I'm comparing it to the painting on the right, the upper right, which is Melancholy by Munch from 1892. But then on the bottom, what I've done is I've cut out that top part of the pier. See it? With the White House. And then I've shown it to you in the bottom against the still frame by, by Bergman. Now, Munch is certainly an artist that had a huge, cast a huge shadow over all artists in Scandinavia, really, especially in the early 20th century. He doesn't even die, he doesn't die until 1944. But certainly Bergman was aware of the very rich tradition of painting in Sweden and in Norway, outside of the more avant-garde painters like Munch. I recently gave a series of talks about neglected traditions of 19th century painting, speaking about Russia, Belgium, Holland, England, and Italy. And this would be true of Scandinavia. You know, we have, you've heard me say this a million times, such a Franco-centric view of the 19th century. We think that the only painters were French. But there were so many rich traditions, and Scandinavia is certainly no exception. So this is Richard Berg's painting on the left, called Nordic Summer Evening from 1899 to 1900. Anders Zorn, Z-O-R-N, Summer Vacation on the right from 1886. Berg is a well-known Swedish painter from Stockholm, and Zorn is one of the country's foremost artists. And this particular painting on the right, which is in fact a watercolor, it's not even an oil, it's a watercolor, it holds the position of being Sweden's, how should we say this, Sweden's priciest painting ever sold. This sold in 2010 for 26 million Swedish kroner, which would be just under $3 million. And it's a watercolor, and it's the most ever paid for a Swedish painting. These summer evenings, you know, you got to worry about the winter, so when the summer comes, you want to be out there taking advantage of it. And so paintings like this by Peter Kreuer, Summer Evening on Skagen's southern beach here on the left from 1893, and it's almost the same title, Summer Evening on the Beach at Skagen, The Painter and His Wife on the right from 1899. Light, this Scandinavian light, in this case the Skagen light, is very important to Bergman and his cinematographers. Also these family celebrations, these scenes where you have an extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everybody, and usually over some kind of a dinner or some kind of a festive event. So this is Kreuer again, Peter Kreuer's Hip Hip Hurrah on the left from 1888, and the Hirschsprung family on the right from 1881. You could almost lift out some of these scenes and you would be looking at a scene from Fanny and Alexander or other Bergman films where he's stressing family and these extended relationships. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about all Bergman films. I'm going to kind of just talk about some themes and ideas that I think are relevant, and we'll be skipping over some films that might be among your favorites, some that perhaps you're not, even not that familiar with, because it's a huge body of work. So this is Summer Interlude, which is a film from 1951. And it had a different title in America. In the UK, it was called Illicit Interlude, because there's some kissing, basically. But what's interesting about Summer Interlude, I just watched it again a few weeks ago. It holds up really well. It's a great film. And what's interesting about it is that encapsulated in that film are so many formal and thematic ideas and devices that Bergman will use for the rest of his career. He kind of throws them all in here. He may just touch upon them briefly in this film, and then he'll sort of expand them later. So we have, for example, this elegiac sort of nostalgic setting of a Scandinavian summer. That's one theme. Youthful romance is another theme. The loss of innocence is another theme. The ill-fated love affair is another theme. Loss of faith in God is another theme. The effects of aging is another theme. This is all in the same film. the use of mirrors as symbols of vanity and memento mori, discussions of the artist's life, the difficulty of being an artist, and so we see an artist in the film, she's a ballet dancer, and how her life is affected by her commitment to her career and other obstacles. We even have the young couple picking wild strawberries in the film. So, I mean, it's got everything here. And it has another scene that's particularly important, and I'm going to hold back on that one, but that is a very prescient foretaste of one of the most famous scenes in The Seventh Seal. I'll show you that in a second. So here's the dancer, summer interlude on the right from 1951. I'm comparing it to an Edgar Degas pastel seated dancer from 1881. Certainly movement dance. Again, Bergman was very interested in dance and choreography in that sense. When you watch him work on the stage, we have lots of film of Bergman directing on the stage where he's moving people around, or even in his films. I mean, he's literally, okay, you're gonna walk 3 steps, turn right, then turn left, then touch the doorknob, then you're gonna back up 2 paces, that kind of thing. So in the film, the dancer is Marie, her name is Marie. She's at the sort of height of her fame and powers, but she senses that now it's gonna be downhill. She's going to be getting older and not going to be able to have the same kind of career as a prima ballerina. And so she decides to go back. She revisits the island of her youth where she had her first great love affair. And so the film has a certain sort of, again, nostalgic feel, but also has aspects of it that are somewhat dark. The French director, Jean-Luc Godard, said about the film, he said, quote, where has he, quote, admired other Bergman films, he loved Summer Interlude. So he admired a lot of Bergman films, but he loved this particular film. Here she is, taking off her toe shoes and massaging her feet and getting ready to soak them in some water. And again, this is the kind of subject that Degas loved. These awkward moments, adjusting your shoes. This is Dancer adjusting her shoe from 1896. Mirrors are very important in Bergman, the visual effect of a mirror. So in Summer Interlude, here on the left, we see her in the dressing room and she's taking off her makeup, and one of her colleagues, who's the man reflected in the mirror, he had just performed in the ballet Coppelia. He was Dr. Coppelius, so he's in his makeup. And a man who's in love with this dancer is standing in the center. And so he is her colleague is talking to her about the fact that she's getting old and her career is going to end, and one has to be prepared for that's what an artist's life is about. And already here there's this kind of tension between choosing a life outside of the arts, outside of being a ballerina, and having love and having a family and having a different kind of life that's sort of being presented to her as well. On the right is Wild Strawberries from 1957, where the young girl shows the professor here his reflection in the mirror. Of course, this whole movie is sort of a dream where he goes back to where he was from and to where he was raised, the house. And now he inserts himself. He watches all these scenes kind of unfold, but he's very much aware of his mortality and approaching death. But one of the great things in Summer Interlude is that when this woman arrives at this island where she had this love affair, as she gets off the ferry and she starts to walk into the island, and all of a sudden this lady appears. And she's just walking past her, and she walks past, and then she stops and turns back and looks at the woman, like you see on the right. And of course, this is clearly a death-like figure. She's all in black. She has very high-keyed cake makeup on, and that leads to another moment later. This is Summer Interlude again, same film on the left from 1951. And on the right is the famous scene of the chess playing scene in Seventh Seal from 1957. But in Summer Interlude, the woman who comes back, and she was a girl, obviously, growing up, and there was a priest who was always there, and that's the priest you see there on the left. And she sort of asked, and he would always play chess with her aunt. Actually, it's the aunt of her boyfriend. That's his family. And so at one point, she asked him, "Why did you always play chess with my boyfriend's aunt?" And he said, "Because it reminded me of death." And you can see in the quote there, "I love a feeling of sitting next to death." That's the actual dialogue that you see there. "I love a feeling of sitting next to death himself." Now that's a woman on the left. That's not a man. But then you see the scene some 6 years later when he filmed Seventh Seal. He really almost brings back that scene almost entirely. Smiles of a Summer Night, again, a wonderful film. Lots of people discuss whether Bergman was a great comedic director. He certainly was in many ways, and he liked comedy, and he was very sensitive to it. This film is, again, a lovely film, nostalgic, and it deals with, again, these extended families and intrigues and passions and kind of naughty behavior. So what you very often see here is, again, a kind of quoting of Swedish 19th century painting. This is Bergman on the right, a very famous scene from Smiles of a Summer Night, against the painting on the left called Midsummer Dance from 1897. There's this predilection throughout Bergman and throughout Scandinavian 19th century painting with summer, as I said. So you have summer interlude, summer escape, summer rendezvous, summer's ending, summer's beginning. It's always summer somewhere in the title to make you think about it. This is one of the great scenes from Smiles of a Summer Night when this couple finally sort of reconciles themselves to each other, and it's from 1955 again, and it's in front of this windmill. They're running through this field here. Bergman is very sensitive to symbols and symbolism, especially coming from the visual arts, and especially coming from painting, and especially coming from Swedish painting. He visited many, many churches with his father, who was a pastor. When he was a young boy, his father would be tending to the congregation, and Ingmar would be seated and looking around at all these frescoes and paintings on the walls and in this vaults, etc. And what you're looking at on the right is part of a fresco by a very famous painter. His name is Albertus Pictor. He dies in 1507. He's a northern painter, and he worked extensively in Sweden as a fresco painter. And this is in Uppsala County. There's a church. It's the Hackaberga Church, and it has these frescoes that you're seeing on the right. And one of the major motifs is the Wheel of Fortune, or the Wheel of Fortune, the Wheel of Life. That is turning here, you see it. And in the Wheel of Life or in the Wheel of Fortune, you can either be on top, things are going well, but the wheel keeps turning, and then all of a sudden you find yourself, things aren't going so well. And so it's a way of reminding you that life is transient, the good things, the bad things will change. There's a scroll with the inscription. What that says is, "I shall reign, I have reigned, I am powerless." So it's a reminder of where we're all headed. And there's a figure of a jester here playing a flute. So here's the wheel, here's death, here grabbing this guy as he comes down. And the jester to the left is probably a symbol of pride. He's playing music. While all this stuff is going on, he should be sensitive to the Wheel of Life, the Wheel of Fortune. He's sort of oblivious to it all instead. Now, keep that fresco in mind, and we're going to come back to some things related to that now as we get into what some people consider Bergman's masterpiece. It's hard to say because he made so many great films. This would be in my top 3 or 4, certainly. This is the Seventh Seal in 1957. That's the Swedish poster on the left, and then the English, UK, and American poster on the right. Now, I mentioned Strindberg as a source for Bergman, and certainly he's a very important source. But from a more purely visual point of view,
Bergman certainly is aware of the expressionist tradition of filmmaking that had taken place in Germany and in Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, in the very early decades of the 20th century. So here on the left, at the left top, is a frame from the film called The Phantom Carriage, and then that's the poster for it. Below, this was a Swedish film, silent film from 1921, directed by Victor Sjöström. The next pairing in the center, the top and the bottom, is of course the great German expressionist film Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, from 1922 by the German director F.W. Murnau. And then on the right, top and bottom, is frame and a poster from Bergman's The Magician from 1958. And you see in each case I've selected these passages where there is a carriage going through the forest, Sjöström, Murnau, and Bergman. And it creates, in the case of the Sjöström, this is the carriage of death, essentially, that comes to claim people when it's time for them to, when they are meant to die. The man comes to collect them on the carriage. Of course, the Murnau is famous because he actually filmed this in backwards. So he cranked it backwards when he was filming it to show this carriage approaching with this vampire, Count Orlok, as the driver of the carriage. And then this really beautiful, similar kind of atmospheric scene in the Bergman film. Bergman was well aware of German expressionism and Scandinavian expressionism. So films like Murnau's films, certainly The Captain of Dr. Caligari, going back before Murnau, The Golem, Phantom Carriage, and also, of course, the work of the Danish director Carl Theodor Dreyer, two particular films, Passion of Joan of Arc and Vampira, another vampire movie by Dreyer. Bergman had an obsession with the Phantom Carriage. Every summer at home, he had a private screening room in his house and every summer he watched this film. So every year he would watch this film. And then he said at one point about the film, "My relationship with the Phantom Carriage is very special. I was 15 years old when I saw it for the first time. I remember it as one of the major emotional and artistic experiences of my life." Sjöström is a very, very important director in the history of Swedish cinema. So he was a director, he directed and starred in this movie, actually, and he wrote it too. So Bergman had a great affection for Sjöström, a great respect for him. And when it came time to make Wild Strawberries, Sjöström was still alive. He wasn't working anymore, he was in his 70s. And Bergman cast him as the professor. He's the actor in Wild Strawberries. So that was his last sort of foray into cinema. Here's one of the great frames from Nosferatu by Murnau on the left, where the Count is coming up the stairs. And this is Bergman on the right, from The Silence from 1963, with Sven Nykvist as the cinematographer. This is a shot on the left from the Phantom Carriage, where the carriage is going across the horizon and it's pulled, the horizon line is very low to the, well, high, actually it's a very high horizon line. And this is Seventh Seal, which I'm sure you've seen a million times. The end of this Dance of Death in Seventh Seal from 1957. Seventh Seal has a story, and I'm sure most of you have seen this film. It deals with this disillusioned crusader knight named Antonius Block, who's played by Max von Sydow, who has come back from the Crusades, and as soon as he reaches his homeland, along with his squire named John, death is waiting for him. And death says, you know, it's your time. It's good that you got through all that, but it's still your time. And then the knight says, okay, I understand. He said, but I understand you play chess. And Death says, well, how would you know that? And he said, well, I know, I've heard it around. And then he says, well, let's play a game of chess. Before you take me, let's play a game of chess. And if you win, fine, I'll go with you.
And if you lose, I get to hang around a little bit longer. So that's what you see going on here. And this is the great moment because the knight, Antonius, takes the two pieces to see who's going to move first. So you have a black piece and a white piece in your fist, and then you hand them out, and then the guy chooses. And when Death taps his fist, he opens it up. And of course, it's the black piece. And Death says, "Don't you think that's appropriate that he chose the black piece?" So that's what you see happening there on the left. Now, the frescoes of Albertus Pictor, the man I just mentioned, who had painted that Wheel of Fortune, that Wheel of Life, is very relevant here to so much of the Seventh Seal. This is the Täby Church in Uppland, north of Stockholm. And this is a church that was built in the latter half of the 13th century. And then it was altered in the second half of the 15th century. The altarpiece that you see dates from the 1470s. And then it was frescoed by Albertus Pictor, the man I just mentioned. And most of those frescoes were probably done around in the 1480s. This church, this specific church, as well with several others, were churches that Bergman's father, as a pastor, went to minister. So he would take Ingmar with him on these ministerial, pastoral visits. And while he was taking care of whatever it was he needed to take care of, Ingmar would just sit and roam around and look at all the images. So this church he actually visited. Here are Bergman's parents, Eric and Karen, on the left, a photograph from 1918. And then here is his father, Eric, in the pulpit at the Hedvig Eleonora Church in Stockholm on the right. Bergman came from a whole lineage of preachers and pastors. His great-great-grandfather was a pastor, and he married the daughter of a pastor. His father was a pastor, and he married the daughter of a pastor, and it was just this sort of lineage straight down. Eric Bergman started in a small mining town as a chaplain, but then he rose in the ranks to become one of the most important Lutheran preachers at the time in the various churches in and around Stockholm. Ingmar Bergman leaves us two autobiographies, not one, but two. And he talks a lot about his childhood. Sometimes there's conflicting information even between the two autobiographies, and then sometimes that conflicts with interviews that he gave to the press at other times. But one thing that holds pretty clear throughout is the difficulty of his relationship with his father. His father was a disciplinarian. He was a very pietistic and rather puritanical individual. He believed in punishment. He believed in death and hell and fire and brimstone. And he believed that you were never too young to be sort of inculcated with this. If Ingmar Bergman, as a child, wet the bed or whatever, his father would lock him in a closet. Things like that. And he wanted a relationship with his father, but it was almost virtually impossible because of how authoritarian his father was. This was a tension throughout Bergman's life, and in fact, he didn't really reconcile with his father until really just shortly before he died in 2007. So that relationship in films, father-son, authoritarian, weaker child, things like that, is very much coming from his life. And what's interesting is that is almost a replication of Edvard Munch's life. This is Munch's father on the right, who was a military doctor. He wasn't a minister. And that's Munch's mother on the left with all the children. That's the young Edvard here. And this is his sister Sophie that he was devoted to, who died of tuberculosis, as did his mother. Munch's childhood was almost a carbon copy of Bergman's, with these very strict rules, authoritarian parenting, very little affection coming from the father. And in the case of Bergman's mother, there was a slightly more affectionate relationship, but he actually speaks and writes about going to his mother. And he said at one point something like, I used to love to cuddle or something like that. And he talks about going to his mother's lap and wanting her to sort of hold him and caress him. And she would push him away and say, no, that's not appropriate. The woman who provided that for Ingmar Bergman was his grandmother. Bergman's concept of his grandmother's house is right out of Fanny and Alexander. He sees his grandmother was the great nurturer, and he used to love to go to his grandmother's house because she provided the sustenance and support and nurturing that he didn't get from his father or his mother. But getting back to the painting, you remember in the scene that I just described in Seventh Seal is where the knight plays chess with death. And in the church that I just mentioned, the Tabby Church interior vault that you see here, there is this scene. And this is by Albertus Pictor. It's the fresco that depicts playing chess with death from 1480. There's no doubt Bergman knew this as a child. And this scene of a knight playing chess with death, or at least a nobleman playing chess with death, stays with him. He said about these visits to these churches with his father, he said, quote, "As a child, I was sometimes allowed to accompany my father when he traveled about to preach in the small country churches in the vicinity of Stockholm. While father preached away in the pulpit, I devoted my interest to the church's mysterious world of low arches, thick walls, the smell of eternity, the colored sunlight quivering above, the strangest vegetation of medieval paintings and carved figures on ceilings and walls. There was everything that one's imagination could desire: angels, saints, dragons, prophets, devils, humans. They were very frightening animals, serpents in paradise, Balaam's ass, Jonah's whale, the eagle of the Revelation. In a wood sat Death, playing chess with the Crusader. Clutching the branch of a tree was a naked man with staring eyes, while down below stood Death, sawing away to his heart's content. Across gentle hills, Death led the final dance towards the dark lands. But in the other arch, the Holy Virgin was walking in a rose garden, supporting the child's faltering steps, and her hands were those of a peasant woman. Her face was grave, and birds' wings fluttered round her head." So there's no question these images had an impression on him. There is one other specific example of this idea of the Death playing chess with a nobleman. It's not in Sweden, and I don't believe, but I'm not sure, I don't believe Bergman ever went to this church. This is in Ilanz, Switzerland. It's the St. Margaretenkirche. It's a church that was built around 1494. This is the inside, and you see some of the fresco painting. And here's the same subject. Death is pointing to the hourglass here. Here's the hourglass, and Death is pointing to the hourglass. And so is this woman here. She's playing for time. Another church, and this one Bergman did visit because it's outside of Stockholm, it's in Uppsala County, is the Harkeberga Church here, built probably between 1250 and 1300. It's a Lutheran church. All these churches were Lutheran churches. And it contains another sort of treasure trove of preserved frescoes by Pictor in this church as well. And here he's probably depicting, some of the works here are coming from, there was a very famous medieval illustrated book. It was called the Biblia Pauperum, the Book of the Poor, essentially. And what it showed, it was a kind of like a comic book. It had framed images of stories being, so that people who couldn't read could tell what they meant by the images. Images from that book were probably the source for some of the frescoes that Pictor portrayed here. So here's one of the characters on the ceiling, Fool playing a lute from that 1480, and that's a moment on the right from the Seventh Seal from 1957, the Jester. I showed you this guy already, the Fool playing the fife and drum, and here's one of the other jesters from the Seventh Seal on the right. Here is the great knight framed from Seventh Seal, Antonius Block, the great crusading knight who's come back. He's weary after having been off for 10 years to the Crusades. He comes back. He has a squire named Johns who's kind of grumpy but obedient. All he wants to do is go home. But as I said, the moment he steps foot on the homeland is when death approaches to call him away. This is Albrecht Dürer on the right. Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513, one of the great Dürer engravings. This is the one that we have here at the gallery. We have several versions of it. Initially, Bergman wanted to title Seventh Seal, he wanted to title it The Night and Death. That was his original intention as a title, clearly related again to the Dürer. So here is Death himself, who comes to claim the night. At first the night doesn't see him, he's sort of making camp on the shore, and then he looks up and this guy's standing there. And then we know what happens with the chess game. The reference literally to Albertus Pictor is probably in this film, because in the Seventh Seal there's a moment when we meet a painter on a scaffolding painting a church with frescoes. That's what you see on the left and on the right here. It's the knight's squire who meets him, and he questions the painter. So what are you doing? What do you do? What is all this? What does this mean? Why are you a painter? And he gives this whole discussion about being an artist, about painting, about dealing with themes of life and death. When asked about the Seventh Seal, Bergman said in another interview, quote, "My intention has been to paint in the same way as the medieval church painter, with the same objective interest and with the same tenderness and joy." Very often in Bergman films, artists are protagonists. They're present. They might be painters, ballet dancers, writers, composers, whatever. And they address what it means to be an artist through Bergman's eyes, of course. Another church that Bergman went to with his father was the Tensta Church. Again, this is in Uppsala County. Again, a 13th century church. This has frescoes from a different individual, not by Albertus Pictus, by a German artist named Johannes Rosenrad, who worked in Sweden. Now here, there's an interesting thing. I'm showing you a still from the Seventh Seal up here, where Scott, one of the jesters, it's his time, and to get away from death, he's climbed up a tree, but death's gonna saw down the tree. So he's looking down at death, kind of saying, gee, don't you have something better to do, and all of that. And it's really quite funny, because he says, I'm supposed to perform tonight, and then death says, well, it's canceled, and all of that. And prior to that, we've seen this head of a crucifix. So there's this beautiful kind of parallelism. But this idea of having run up a tree to hide from death is again an image that came from frescoes that certainly Bergman saw. And in this case, it's this fresco. Here's a woman, very elegantly dressed. She's climbed up a tree. Here's the devil, and here's death sawing the tree. There are so many parallels here and similarities here between what Bergman saw in these frescoes, where death is this sort of thinly covered skeleton, and he saw in the trunk of the tree. The title, as best we can figure the title, is Death Saws Down the Tree, in which a rich man, it's actually a man, I said a woman, a rich man sits while the devil writes a protocol. So the devil's working on a protocol here. Now, the fact that it's a rich person in the tree, it's always a rich person in the tree, relates to the idea of a treasure. And in Swedish, the word for treasure is skatt, S-K-A-T-T, and this character's name in the movie is Scott, but it's spelled S-K-A-T. It's a play on the Swedish word for treasure when he's sort of up in the tree here. And so here we see death sawing the tree. And here I'm giving it to you in live action. So here's Scott up the tree, looking down at death. Your time is up. And then there's this wonderful dialogue about, I have a performance, what about this, what about that, and death just has an answer. So again, Bergman talking about these images and about these churches and about this formative period, he said, quote, "Like all churchgoers have at times, I let my mind wander as I contemplated the altarpieces, triptychs, crucifixes, and stained glass windows and murals. I would find Jesus and the two robbers in blood and torment, and Mary leaning on St. John. Women, behold thy son, behold thy mother. Mary Magdalene, the sinner who had been the last to sleep with her. The night playing chess with death. Death sawing down the tree of life. A terrified wretch wringing his hands in the top of it." So clearly these images stayed with him. This is another one from the same church. It's a slightly different story here. This is, again, a Rosenrod work, Johannes Rosenrod, The Devil, the Old Woman, and the Shoes. She's up here holding a pair of shoes, and here's the devil he's handing these shoes up to her on this rod. And then another Wheel of Fortune going around. I probably don't have time to go through this story, but this is a German folk tale. And it was known in Scandinavia, and they had a sort of Scandinavian version of it. And the story is about a married couple they're very happily married and they live peacefully together, and the devil is really irritated because of that. They have a good marriage. And so he goes to this old woman in the village and he says, "Look, if you can bring discord between these two people, in other words, ruin their marriage, I'll give you a beautiful pair of leather slippers." So she says, "Okay, let's see what I can do." Then she goes to the wife of the couple when she's alone, and she says, "Do you have a good husband? Do you get along with him?" And the woman says, "Oh yes, I could never find a better husband in my whole life." And then the lady says to the woman, "Well, I will tell you a means of guaranteeing that you will never quarrel with him. This evening, after he's gone to bed and fallen asleep, take a knife and cut off a few of the hairs that grow on his Adam's apple. If you do that, you will never quarrel with one another." So the lady thinks, "Oh, okay." So then she goes and finds the guy. He's out working in a field. And she says, "Do you have a very good wife?" And he says, "Oh, yes, she's wonderful." And then the woman says, "Well, I would not trust women folk. Don't trust your wife too much. You should know that tonight, while you are asleep, she intends to slit your throat." And then the husband said, "Ooh, wow, thanks for telling me." So that evening he's pretending to be asleep, and his wife comes up because she's going with a knife to get a little bit of the hair on his Adam's apple, right? And he thinks, of course, that she's about to kill him. So she rips the knife from her hand, and he slits her throat. The devil thinks this is fantastic. And in fact, he's so impressed. He said, "I don't even think I could have come up with something as brilliant as what you came up with. But in fact, it's so brilliant and it's so hideous that you frighten me. I'm the devil, but you frighten me." And so he says, "I'm going to give you your shoes, but you get up there, I'm going to just hand you these shoes on a pole because I don't even want to get near you." So that's what you see happening. That's what you see happening here. You could see how these stories, especially for a young boy or girl, they would stay with you. I guess that's an understatement. This is a painting by Peter Baltens. Baltens is kind of within the circle of Peter Bruegel. In the Flemish Renaissance, he's a Flemish Renaissance painter. It's called "A Performance of the Farce of the Phony Water" from 1550. It's in the Rijksmuseum today in Amsterdam. That's a detail on the right. This was another famous story that everybody knew. It was about a village scene where the wife sends her husband to find water that's supposed to cure disease, sort of miracle water. And while he's away looking for this miracle water, she has a tryst with her lover. The husband finds out and he catches her, and so the plot is sort of thwarted. So you see here, there's the painting, and then within the painting is a performance, right? And here's Bergman on the left from The Seventh Seal, when he shows this troupe of traveling actors and jugglers and jesters performing. It's almost a literal quote, almost, of the painting. These are these wandering troops, these minstrels, these clowns, with these saltimbancs, and of course that brings us to our painting at the National Gallery. Here is Picasso's family of saltimbancs that we have from 1905, and on the right is a frame from Sawdust and Tinsel by Bergman from 1953. Many Bergman films are dedicated to people who professionally are attached to the arts. They're performers, circus performers, writers, playwrights, composers, whatever, from sublime to the more mundane. So you see these characters throughout his work. He focuses especially on the fact that there are these traveling groups or troupes, that they're sort of isolated from society, they live amongst themselves, they have no fixed roots, like Picasso, as Picasso was attracted to the saltimbancs, and many French painters were as well. So the circus performer is a stand-in for the artist, as alienated, lonely, not in step with society, and all of that. In an interview that Bergman gave, he actually specifically cited this painting, the Picasso saltimbancs, and Durer's etching, Night, Death, and the Devil, as inspirations for the Seventh Seal. He specifically mentioned three things that inspired him for the Seventh Seal. One was the painting by Picasso, one was the print by Durer, and the third one was the choral work, not quite an oratorio, by Karl Orff, Carmina Burana. Carmina Burana is based on these medieval songs by what we think were known, they were these traveling groups called Goliards. It's a Goliardic tradition. Could have been theology students or actually even ministers who hadn't been given permanent positions anywhere, and they would travel. They were like vagabonds, and they would travel throughout Europe. They would be beholden to people's kindness. They would beg for food and for shelter, and almost all their songs are rather bawdy songs about morals, mockery, love, drinking, gaming, etc. And what Bergman said about this kind of group, whether they be saltimbancs or Goliardic travelers, he said, quote, "What attracted me was the whole idea of people traveling through the downfall of civilization and culture, bringing birth to new songs. One day when I was listening to the final chorale in Carmina Burana, it suddenly struck me that I had the theme for my next film." So that was when he was working on Seventh Seal. So here's a shot from the Seventh Seal and a large drawing by Picasso. When Picasso finished our painting of the saltimbancs, he planned to do a second one. That never was realized. But one of the really large-scale sketches for it exists today at the Met, and that's what you see there on the left. It's the same idea of these horses and riders and traveling itinerant performers who are in this kind of wasteland. Sometimes it looks like these vast sand dunes and the sea. Here again, this is Picasso's boy leading a horse on the right, 1905. And Seventh Seal, again, this is the family of the juggler and his wife and his child. This saltimbanc theme, Bergman could have seen one of the most famous saltimbanc paintings right in Sweden. It's this one, the Acrobat Family. This is in Gothenburg, so it's in a museum in Sweden. There you see it on the left, the Acrobat Family from 1905. In the Seventh Seal, there are these scenes of the way these people live. And they live this really simple but beautiful life, and it's a life that the knight, the crusader who's been covered in blood for 10 years and is sensing death, has never experienced. So this very famous scene when the family offers the knight strawberries and milk, and he's never had this kind of familial experience of a family, and with the children, that's his page or squire there on the far left. And what Bergman is equating very often this family with almost is like Mary, Joseph, and the Christ child. It has almost that kind of religious connotation. The jester, the juggler, this is the clown that's in Sawdust and Tinsel from 1953 on the left. And this is Picasso's The Seated Harlequin from 1923.
The Dance of Death, which has a ubiquitous sort of history in the history of art, this Dance of Death, the Dance Macabre, is something that Bergman was particularly sensitive to, and he knew many versions of it, many interpretations of it. It plays a prominent role in the end of the Seventh Seal. And in the Seventh Seal, at one point, death, the figure of death actually states to one character, quote, "No one escapes me," unquote. So again, this is the ultimate sort of demise. One great Dance of Death, I have no evidence that Bergman knew this, but it's one of the great examples, is this one from 1466. It's from Estonia. It's in an Estonian church, entitled The Dance of Death. Bernd Notke is the artist. This is a gorgeous, it remains in beautiful condition for what part of it there is. Originally it was 98 feet long. It's tempera paint on linen. Originally it was 98 feet long. Today only 24 feet of it remain, and that was at some point cut into two pieces, a 20-foot piece and a 4-foot piece. And then during the conservation in the 19th century, they sewed those two pieces together, even though they technically don't go next to each other. So this is the kind of dance where we start with the preacher at the far left, and then we see a figure of death, and then we see another figure of death carrying a coffin, and then we go through all of the hierarchy, all the people of society who are high and mighty and powerful, who think maybe that they're going to escape death because they're so powerful. So then we have the empress and the cardinal, and ultimately we have death and the king. We have a huge, here's death and the king. We have a huge banderole here that is essentially each of these characters speaking. So underneath each of the characters is what it is that they're saying. And underneath the empress, she says, "I know death means me. I was never terrified so greatly. I thought he was not in his right mind after all. I am young and also an empress. I thought I had a lot of power. I had not thought of him or that anybody could do something against me. Oh, let me live on. This I implore you." So each person now realizes that despite their status in society, death still trumps, so to speak. This is the way it's preserved today in the church. It's in the case here. So another shot. This is Wild Strawberries. Gunnar Fischer was the cinematographer, not Nyquist. This is the Swedish poster and the American poster that you see here. Here is Bergman with Victor Sjöström, that great director, the silent film star and director. They're discussing one of the scenes on Wild Strawberries. This is a photograph from July 12th, 1957. This film, again, is one of Bergman's greatest. Right up from the opening frame, you see Albrecht Dürer again, because this is one of the opening frames where we see the professor in his study on the right, and it looks almost exactly like the study of St. Jerome in his study by Dürer on the left from 1514. Bergman is well aware of the beautiful Scandinavian tradition of the family, of these beautiful sort of breakfasts and lunches and brunches, and everybody's clean and brush their teeth and looks really nice, and everybody's wearing white, and it's all so pure and idyllic, and it doesn't even look like it could be real. So in Wild Strawberries, we have a scene like that here, these wonderful twins here. And there's all this familiar banter and all this beautiful food and elegance and everything that's on the table, and it's all sun-drenched. And this comes right out of Scandinavian painting. This is the painter Fanny Brott on the left. She's a Swedish painter, called A Day of Celebration from 1902. And Peter Kreuer, remember I mentioned him. This is a painting called The Benson Sisters, 1897. But Wild Strawberries has a wide arc of imagery, and in one place where there's a dream, it's very surreal. And this scene is probably the most surreal in some ways until we get to Hour of the Wolf by Bergman later. where the professor here has this dream that he's on this deserted street. The clocks have no hands, time is up, he keeps looking up. So here he is looking at his pocket watch. At another point in the movie, he's presented with this watch that has no hands. And then he sees a man coming down the street who has this kind of rubber, shall we say, face, who doesn't speak to him, but leads him towards a coffin that's on the curb that has fallen out of a hearse. And the professor looks at it and sees this hand, and then he approaches the coffin with great dread, and of course it's him. He's dead in the coffin. So this is this kind of surreal dream that's worthy of Luis Buñuel or Dali or René Clair or Man Ray. Certainly Bergman was aware of the tradition of surrealist film, not just German expressionist film. But I think Munch is relevant here. Munch's great self-portrait Between Clock and Bed from 1940-43, notice the clock has no hands on it, the grandfather clock. And this very strange, interesting painting by Munch, Self-Portrait with Striped Pullover from 1940-44, we're supposed to think it's kind of a straight-on shot, and the guy's wearing a pullover sweater that has this kind of striped pattern. But the more you look at it, the more it looks like he's laying down, and that the stripe becomes like a skeleton. It's like maybe he's in his coffin. And there are these overhead shots in Wild Strawberries where the professor is sleeping and dreaming that seem, again, quite relevant to what we see often in Munch. I mean, I could go on. There's this scene, one of the most famous at the end of the film, where the professor, he's been carried back to his childhood, and he looks out at this lake and he sees his mother and father. His father is fishing, and his mother is, I think she's sewing or knitting. I'm showing you this against Renoir's Fisherman with Rod and Line from 1874, because this is, again, a very standard kind of trope, the couple fishing by the water. And the professor looks out, and then at one point, beautifully, his parents look at him, and they wave. And then Bergman cuts to the face of the professor here, when he sees that, because that is his life, that is his childhood, those are his parents, and he has this incredible nostalgic kind of affectionate flashback. And about this scene, getting Zostrom the right expression, Bergman said, quote, "Never before or since have I experienced the face so noble and enlightened, and yet this was nothing more than a piece of acting in a dirty studio." But Zostrom was able to evoke this idea of nostalgia and of his parents just through facial expression. The close-up for Bergman is very important. Virgin Spring, all kinds of references here to art history, to the Last Supper, here in the cottage of the farmer and his wife here. Constant cross-alliteration between art, nature, and religion. Here we're in the wife, that crucifix, which is so ubiquitous in Bergman, it comes through so many different, it's not the same crucifix, but that presence of Christ comes through in so many different ways. And then for me, one of the most powerful scenes in Virgin Spring. I told you to remember that birch tree in Strindberg. So this is the scene where Max von Sydow and he's the father, he has a young daughter named Karen, and she goes out and she is brutally raped and murdered. And then he finds out about this, and at that moment, he finds out that the men who perpetrated this crime are in his house. He's brought them as guests. And so, without saying anything, he goes off to this field, and he finds this birch tree here, and he takes a sword with him because he's going to chop down the tree. But he stands for a moment. It's really a powerful scene. He stands first, just stands and looks at the tree. And what's really powerful here is the soundtrack. The wind going through the leaves of this tree, the soundtrack is very important here. He stands, and then he drops the sword, and then he just jumps on the tree. He attacks it. And he starts to bend it down.
until it breaks. He breaks it, and he falls onto the ground and breaks the tree. And then he takes the sword to cut off the branches because he needs these branches, these birch tree branches, because he's going to go through a sauna, a ritual purification in a sauna, where he's going to flog himself with these branches as a way of purifying himself, but even also as a way of punishing himself for what he's about to do. Because what he's about to do is he's going to kill every one of those people that murdered his daughter. It's one of the most incredible 10 or 15 minutes as he's contemplating this action and goes through this sauna and then goes off to perform this deed. This is Winter Light, 1963. This movie was very close to Bergman because it was very close to representing the figure of his father. It's a very complicated film. It's part of a group of films in which the subject is the loss of faith. Bergman's loss of faith in God. This is a lifelong trope for Bergman. So here's the church. It's a small church in a rural community. The filming here is really quite masterful. It's Sven Nykvist. He does everything here to make this look dreary and cold and really quite kind of foreboding. Here's the church. The preacher is saying Mass. That you're only about 6 or 7 people in this community who come to the Mass, who come to church. There's a sacral feeling in this movie when he shows the whole performance of the Eucharist and administering the Eucharist, and then these beautiful shots here. So it's just they're purely sacral moments in the whole thing. And they have all kinds of levels of meaning, bread, wine, body, blood, transubstantiation, faith, no faith, all of this. He's constantly giving us these art references, the altarpiece, the man who he's the guardian of faith, but of course the theme of this film is that in essence this pastor no longer believes himself. And he has to minister to the needs of these people. And he's in crisis through the whole film. It's interesting because it's almost Bergman portraying himself through his father. It's a very interesting kind of transference. This crucified Christ that is in this movie reminds me of the one from the Great Degenerate Art Show that was later destroyed by Ludwig Gies, Crucified Christ from 1921. Here's where he's ministering to Max von Sydow, who's totally depressed and feels there's no reason to live, and he has all these problems, and he's totally lost his faith. And so the minister, the pastor, is trying to minister to him, but by the time they finish the conversation, Max von Sydow is ministering to the priest because the priest is saying, I don't really believe this either. I think it's awful. I think Munch is relevant. I was really intrigued when I found this. I mean, this is Munch's painting Night in St. Cloud on the left from 1890. And in Winter Light, a scene where Marta, the female protagonist, has her own sort of crisis of faith. And she sits by herself on this pew in the church and contemplates her situation, very comparable to the situation we see with Munch, where this was at the moment in Munch's life when he had been told his father had died. He was in Paris. And then he was in St. Cloud, just outside of Paris, and then he got word that his father had died back in Christiania. Very often in Bergman, as in Munch, death is a kind of empty space. It's a void, that idea. Even the cross shapes that are created on the floor by the window. Persona, again, I'm going to move, because I'm going to finish here. All kinds of visual parallels to Munch. These scenes where there is a couple in the background conspiring or in some kind of adulterous complicity, and the person who's being affected by this or traumatized by it is then shown frontally. So this is a scene in Persona on the left from 1966, and this is Munch's painting called Jealousy on the right from 1895, which is exactly the situation where this man, I won't go into all the personalities, but we know who all these people are, He's been betrayed by the woman he loves, who's shown in red, and she's conspiring with her lover. That's exactly what's happening here. There's a conspiratorial moment here in persona. Even from a purely formal point of view, in persona, I think Cubism is quite relevant, where he starts to show shifting and fading and reappearing points of view, where one face morphs into another face. This kind of image with Picasso. Here again, this is a movie called The Silence. That's not persona, that's The Silence from 1963. But especially when he uses the camera for fades or double exposures, or when he doubles figures like this. Here, this is from The Life of Marionettes on the left, the film from 1980, and persona again. For pure Gothic horror, and again, very strongly surrealist, arguably his most Gothic film is Hour of the Wolf from 1968. The cinematography was Sven Nykvist here. This was one of the most polarizing films that Bergman ever produced. People either loved it or they hated it. And after it was released, about 3 years later, he was asked about it, and he said, I made the whole thing the wrong way. He realized, if I were to do it now, I would do it completely differently. It's about an artist who is essentially suffering a psychological nervous breakdown, a la Munch or a la Strindberg. It's very comparable. And he's just losing his grip little by little. He goes off to this cottage on an island. Islands are very big in Bergman. To sort of work, he takes his wife with him, and the deterioration just sort of sets in. So here they are arriving. Even this is spectral. It's like Sharon going there across the river Styx, like this guy is going to his death here. Tremendous cinematography here. A lot of it was shot with just candlelight. This is Hour of the Wolf on the left. That's a painting on the right by the great Danish painter, Wilhelm Hammershøi. It's called Interior Artificial Light from 1909. So that's a painting on the right, very famous Danish 19th century painting. In this movie, there are all kinds of tropes that relate to art and film. Certainly the trope of the eye and the eyeball. So at one party, people are sitting around, and one of the guests takes out her eyes and drops them into a glass here. Of course, this is the famous scene from Un Chien Andalou, An Andalusian Dog, on the left by Salvador Dali and Luis Buñuel from 1929, where she's about to have her eyeball cut with a razor. So this kind of aggression to the viewer, for the surrealist, that was particularly important. Two stills, Bergman's Music in Darkness on the left, 1948, and a shot from Wild Strawberries on the right. He manipulates eyes, eyeballs, close-ups, and again, it reminds one of René Magritte, who was constantly using the eyeball, especially as an indicator of false vision, something that you think is true, but it's not true. So here on the left is The False Mirror by Magritte from 1929. The portrait, you notice that piece of ham has an eye where the bone would be, 1935. At one point in Hour of the Wolf, the guests who are now revealing themselves, they take their eyeballs out and kind of show who they are. So this one lady takes off her face here on the left. So now these people are revealing themselves as some nightmarish monsters. But what we don't know is this the psychosis? Is this actually happening? Is it something that is, we don't know where we are in terms of these events. So I'm comparing the image by Bergman on the left with René Magritte's Lovers from 1928. So some people take out their eyes, some people take off their faces, other people show you that they're like a bug and they can walk up walls. So this man starts to have a stroll up the wall and then across the ceiling. I think this is after Fred Astaire. And again, Magritte, I think, has a kind of, one art historian writing about this painting by Magritte called Kolkanda from 1953 says something that I think is very comparable to Bergman. He says, Magritte was fascinated by the seductiveness of images. Ordinarily, you see a picture of something and you believe in it. You are seduced by it. You take its honesty for granted. But Magritte knew that representations of things can lie. These images of men aren't men, just pictures of them, so they don't have to follow any rules. This is painting. It also makes you aware of the falsity of representation. This is very comparable to the way Bergman thinks very often. The character of the artist, played by Max von Sydow, he undergoes this feminization. He's given, in order to go have this dinner, it's suggested that he sort of doll himself up, I guess is the way you would say it. And so that's what starts to happen here. And then when he appears in this guise, he's totally ridiculed by all the guests. So here is a Munch painting called Ashes from 1894, and the image of the artist in Hour of the Wolf from 1968. Again, the artist who is definitely Munch's successor, I think, is Bergman. And this idea of this meditation on the madness of the artist is very prevalent in both cases. Here again, Melancholy by Munch, 1894. When Bergman was asked about this movie, he was asked about it on repeated occasions. He said in 1994, Hour of the Wolf is seen by some as a regression after Persona. It isn't that simple. Persona was a breakthrough, a success that gave me the courage to keep on searching along unknown paths. For several reasons, that film has become a more open affair than others, more tangible. A woman who is mute, another who speaks, therefore a conflict. Hour of the Wolf, on the other hand, is more vague. There is within that film a consciously formal and thematic disintegration. When I see Hour of the Wolf today, I understand that it is about deep-seated division within me, both hidden and carefully monitored, visible in both my earlier and later work. To me, Hour of the Wolf is important since it is an attempt to encircle a hard-to-locate set of problems and get inside them. I dared to take a few steps, but I didn't go the whole way. And maybe that's good for us, because this film it can be very unsettling. Here again, I think relationship to Munch, the artist, and his model, this feminized Max von Sydow. 1972 is Cries and Whispers. Again, it has so much relevance to the tradition of Swedish painting in the 19th century. Beautiful sunlit scenes, the fashion, the costume, the cinematography. Here is a painting by the Swedish painter Bruno Liefors called Anna from 1895, where she's immersed in this green park-like setting. The costumes for this film were so famous, many of them have ended up in museums. Here's one. This is Ingrid Thulund's costume in Cries and Whispers. She was the character of Karen. And this is Peter Kreuer's painting on the right, Summer Evening at Skagen. Of course, this might be the most difficult film to get a hold of and to sit through in some ways. There's no blood or guts or sort of that kind of thing in the film, but it's an incredibly potent investigation of the theme of a woman who is dying of cancer and her two sisters who have never been able to get along with each other and have been estranged from the sister who's dying, who try to tend to her, but the only woman who really is able to bring solace and comfort to the dying woman is her maid and her caregiver, who is this woman back here. So these are the sisters. And these scenes of death, the death room, dying and sickness. This is Munch's Death in the Sick Room from 1895, a shot from Bergman's Cries and Whispers. Of course, this is the life Munch lived with. He was convinced he would die early. His sister died of tuberculosis. His mother died of tuberculosis. He was always by a deathbed. So here's Munch's By the Deathbed, 1896, and Bergman's Cries and Whispers. Bergman, I don't think, ever made another movie this painful. It is hard to watch at times, and it sort of culminates in some of the most incredible moments visually. This woman is in such pain, and she really cannot bear it anymore. And when you look closely here, you have to look closely because those are not her hands coming up to her cheeks. Those are the hands of the caregiver who's taking care of her. So it is kind of related to Munch, except that it's not the hands of the actual person that are coming up. As the woman expires, there's this pietà kind of scene that you see here. I'm going to skip over a long discussion of the close-up in Bergman, but it's very, very important, and how he uses the close-up, how the close-up relates to painting, and the tradition of the frame painting that's a self-possessed hermetic image as opposed to a close-up in a film that does imply space beyond the image itself. Again, in face-to-face. This is where a psychiatrist is married to another psychiatrist. You know, that's a problem right there. And the woman in the relationship begins to have a nervous breakdown. These images of artists, I mentioned already, Alberto's Pictor might be the inspiration for the artist in Seventh Seal. Hour of the Wolf, Max von Sydow is painting. He's there, he's being met by one of the neighbors on the island. Fanny and Alexander, of course, families play a central role in Bergman's thinking. Happy families are rare. And the rituals of family are very often what he deals with, but it's usually fueled by his own memories of his own childhood, of his own family. Strindberg plays a role here, discussions about family as well. So you get different tropes, the vulnerable child, the neglected child, the humiliated child, etc. From a visual point of view, there's an artist who was very important to Bergman for Fanny and Alexander, and that's the artist Carl Larsson. He's a Swedish painter, and he had done a series of important watercolors that were made into a book. The one that you're seeing at the left is called A Home, 24 paintings from 1899. The one on the left is the most famous one, but this is a German edition, not Swedish. It's The House in the Sun from 1909. These illustrations are so famous and so highly regarded, and they are essentially illustrations of the Swedish home. From the outside to the inside, decorators memorize these books. When they want to create a Swedish home, this is what it looked like in the 19th century and earlier. So here is Carl Larsson's Girl with Apple Blossoms on the left from 1914, and I'm comparing it to a frame from Wild Strawberries. This book, The House in the Sun, it was very expensive in Sweden because of the preciousness of the watercolors and the folio edition and all of that. But then it was published in Germany, and it became a blockbuster. It went through 40 print runs up until 2001, and it's still in print. Here is Carl Larsson's Flowers on the Windowsill from 1894, with a shot again from Fanny and Alexander. And my favorite one, Christmas Eve by Carl Larsson on the left, and the shot of Christmas Eve in Fanny and Alexander. And then we end with this wonderful shot. This is in Fanny and Alexander, the young boy who was essentially Bergman growing up, and he has this puppet theater, and he puts on these little performances. Above is the phrase that comes from the Royal Theater in Copenhagen. It says, "Not just for pleasure." Bergman expands the very nature of the film medium, the formal genius of his vision, his deeply personal scripts. He opened viewers up to a new world of cinema, rich in emotion, fearless in exploration of philosophical concerns, engagement with basic existential questions, but he also had a warmth, he had a humor, and a sense of shared humanity. It's interesting regarding Bergman's, what other filmmakers owe to Bergman. There's a whole literature on that, but I've chosen one quote that came from Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick wrote a letter to Bergman on February 9th, 1960, and what he said to Bergman in this letter was, quote, "Your vision," he said, "Dear Mr. Bergman, your vision of life has moved me deeply, much more deeply than I have ever been moved by any films. I believe you are the greatest filmmaker at work today, unsurpassed by anyone in the creation of mood and atmosphere, the subtlety of performance, the avoidance of the obvious, the truthfulness and completeness of characterization. To this, one must also add everything else that goes into the making of a film." Bergman himself, talking about other debts that he has to other forms of expression, said this: "I think we are the sum of what we have read, seen, and experienced. I do not think artists are born from emptiness. I am a small stone of a tall building. I depend on each element of the building, next to, above, and below." Thanks very much, everybody.